being considered in Tallahassee right now really should alarm every Floridian. This is an agenda that has nothing to do with the quality of life of Floridians. It doesn't address the issues of consequence to our daily lives. It serves really one purpose: to be a launching pad for the governor's presidential ambitions. This is legislation aimed at dividing, scapegoating, dehumanizing. It is a slate that has the government interfering in the most important decisions we make about our own bodies. It is an effort to ban honest conversations about race, about gender identity and sexual orientation. The bills that have become a priority are about less democracy and more surveillance. It empowers the DeSantis administration to have their own, his own private police force, to have state legislators policing our classrooms, our doctors' offices, our workplaces. And there's absolutely no concern for the consequences that are unintended and even worse than the intended consequences. And this all comes as the nation is witnessing a almost daily public slap fight between Governor DeSantis and the former President Trump as they jockey for position. And the worst part about it, we witnessed today a bill that basically would have a chilling effect in our schools, banning discussions of the existence of LGBTQ people, making our students who need the most support more vulnerable, more isolated. It's important that we raise our voices and that we call into account legislators who ought to be accountable to the people of their district, but instead are all too often much more eager to show their loyalty to an extremist agenda. They have to hear from us. They have to understand that there are consequences for using the time in Tallahassee not to repair the issues that are affecting us, not to address important issues of housing and discrimination and equity, but to send a message that they are fearful of the very thing that makes our state strong, the very thing that can jumpstart our economy, drawing the best and the brightest, retaining talent. And so appealing to the smallest, most fearful element in our community in a cynical attempt to garner votes is having a real world impact, making our schools less safe, depriving people of the choice of determining when and whether to have a child, invading the most personal conversations between doctors, parents, and young people. This is not freedom. This is the opposite. And I'm proud to be here with this panel of leaders in the legislature and in school boards and voices from the community, making it clear that we will hold them accountable, that we will raise our voices, that we will fight back, we will push back, and we will not allow the most cynical parts of this agenda to define who we are as Floridians. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Nadine. I now want to turn things over to State Representative Carlos Guillermo Smith.
Thank you, Brandon, and thank you everyone for joining us today. Nadine is right. We've got a very aggressive legislative agenda this session. Many of these bills are overtly anti-LGBTQ, banning honest conversations about sexual orientation, gender identity, and race, trying to police our classrooms, police doctors' offices, police workplaces about how they're going to talk about diversity, equity, and inclusion, as if this is some taboo conversation that we should not be having. I want to address what happened this morning in committee. First bill that we can address, this Don't Say Gay bill, which passed through its first House committee. That's House Bill 1557, for those who are following along. Now, I call it the Don't Say Gay bill because It's going to effectively erase LGBTQ students, families, and LGBTQ history by banning classroom discussion about anything gay or anything trans in K through 5. That's what the bill does. The language is very clear. And in middle and in high school, if someone thinks that it's not age appropriate, the conversation that's happening about LGBTQ existence and identities, if someone thinks that it's not age appropriate in middle or high school, they can sue the school. Well, there's a lot of homophobic people who are out there who don't think any conversation about the existence of LGBTQ people is age appropriate. Age appropriate is a very subjective term, which of course is not defined in the bill. And age appropriate also appears to be very subjective depending on which member of the legislature you're talking to, as we saw in the last committee this morning. Bills like this are stoking further polarization that's happening in our state. Why is the bill necessary? Why are we inviting Floridians to turn against each other in this way through litigation? So if a fourth grader wants to come into their classroom, they've written an essay about their two dads, and they want to present that essay to the classroom to talk about who they are, to talk about who their family is, the school is going to shut it down. Can't talk about it. Don't say gay. The bill sponsor talked about how we're not going to have anything in curriculum that encourages these types of conversations. Well, curriculum is history as well. And I want to point out the tragedy at Pulse nightclub that happened in our state. Deeply impactful to the community in Central Florida and beyond. We should, and we are, encouraging these types of conversations in our schools. The impact that it has had on the surrounding community, on the surviving family members. This is not a taboo discussion. We will not be erased. LGBTQ families will not be invisible. LGBTQ students will not be invisible. They will be seen. They will be supported. They will be loved. Just weeks ago, the Florida Department of Education withdrew all of their anti-bullying resources for LGBTQ youth. Resources that were intended to prevent LGBTQ youth suicides. What are we doing? Why do lawmakers want to pass bills that reverse the progress that we have made? This is not where Floridians are. And it will have a chilling effect on support for LGBTQ youth, on inclusion in our public schools. LGBTQ people are normal, healthy, and we are in every single school in the state of Florida. We are your siblings. We are your brothers and sisters. We are your neighbors. We are your coworkers. We are your teachers. We are your first responders. And conversations about who we are not taboo, and they should not be prohibited in our schools. Now, I do have additional bills that I want to talk about, but forgive me if I needed to respond to what has just taken place in a House committee this morning. House Bill 747 is another bad bill, a healthcare refusal bill, which allows any healthcare provider or insurer to deny critical medical care to a patient. And it's a bill that provides a broad license to discriminate in employment and contracting. No one should be denied access to critical medical care, like a nurse refusing to provide a doctor's prescription for fertility drugs to single women or to lesbian women, hospitals refusing to maintain hormone therapies for transgender patients who need inpatient care in their facility for something unrelated. There's a number of problems with this bill. And then we get, of course, to this Stop Woke Act nonsense. House Bill 7, Senate Bill 148, policing the teaching of Black history, racial oppression, and anti-LGBTQ discrimination in our schools and in our workplaces. I want to point out in this bill how we are dramatically transforming anti-discrimination law in the state of Florida. Anti-discrimination law is meant to protect people from unlawful discrimination based on their sex, their gender, their religion, their ability status, their marital status, their pregnancy status, a number of different protected categories of individuals who face discrimination every single day. And this bill transforms our non-discrimination statutes to define discrimination as how someone feels during a diversity, inclusion, and equity training. So you are in a workplace and you are part of a corporate training on diversity, inclusion, and equity sensitivity training, learning about the experiences of marginalized groups, racial minorities, LGBTQ minorities, learning about discrimination. And in that training, as you're learning about discrimination, if you feel a certain way, if you feel guilty, or if you feel uncomfortable, or if you feel discomfort, now you have been discriminated against, reversing the entire Florida Civil Rights Act on its head. This is nonsense, and it impacts the LGBT community in a tremendous way. And so I'm just gonna leave this here. I'm just gonna leave this discussion here because there's a number of bills that we have to talk about, but they're very, very critical that we have not only members of our community, Floridians, who oppose this type of authoritarian censorship of the freedom of speech of individuals in corporations and in schools, but we actually call on the private sector to be vocal in their opposition for this type of hostile legislation to our community. And I'll leave it there. Thank you, Brendan.
Thank you so much, Rep. Smith. Always powerful and moving, and we really appreciate your time. I want to turn now to State Representative Michelle Raynor.
Thank you, Brandon, and thank you, everyone, for being here. Thank you, Rep. Smith, for your powerful words. And, Rep. Smith kind of gave us an overview of how harmful these bills are. And, it's interesting. The governor, I believe, has indicated especially with the Stop Woke Act, that he doesn't want to provide discomfort to white people. And this is what I'll say. I wish he would feel the same about the discomfort of trans women and trans men who are being killed and at an alarming rate. I wish he would feel the same discomfort about Black and Brown folks who are marginalized. I wish he would feel the same discomfort about folks who can't even afford, as Representative Smith says, that Floridians can't even afford to live in Florida. I wish he would feel the same discomfort that he feels that we need to have this Stop Woke Act and the slew of harmful bills. And I will tell y'all, I have been reading through these bills, and I think I'm quite learned. I know y'all joke, I joke and say I'm a country lawyer, but I've been reading these bills and I've been saying, I can't really quite compute them because it doesn't make sense. specifically the HB 747, which is the healthcare refusal bill, which is so interesting to me because I believe that in my reading, and I've talked with some other doctors and attorneys, on its face, it's unconstitutional. And what we're seeing the governor do, and what we're seeing, legislators do, and they know this to be true. And we heard this in committee yesterday when we were talking about the constitutionality of an abortion ban bill, that they know it's unconstitutional, but they're still putting it forth. So not only is this harmful to LGBTQ folks and our families, this also is costing people money that we don't need to be spending, that we could actually be funneling into these problems of making sure people are safe in this state, making sure people have housing in the state, making sure that there's economic equity. And so it's so interesting to me. I asked the bill sponsor about 747 the day that it was filed, called him. I said, well, what happens if someone doesn't want to treat Black folks? Oh, Rep, that's never going to happen. Well, your bill says it can. So I asked him, I said, well, what happens if I'm transgendered and I would like a surgery? Well, then, you shouldn't go to a doctor that doesn't believe in transgender people. Facts. I said, okay, but what if I'm in an emergency situation and I don't have the opportunity to pick the doctor I want to go to? What would I do then? There was no answer. We on this call, the lawmakers and the policymakers and the families and advocates know the consequences that these bills are going to have, unintended and intended consequences. And I would echo the words of Representative Smith. These bills are designed to erase LGBTQ folks. Designed to put us back in the closet. They are designed to make us afraid. They are designed to make us not want to live our full human lives that we've been given. And I will tell you that we're still going to resist and persist because you cannot make us afraid. You cannot put us back in the closet, and you cannot not allow us to live in our full humanness and divineness. And so as I'm going to end my comments as I started my comments, the discomfort the governor feels, I want him to get uncomfortable about the harm that he's causing Black and brown folks in this community, the harm that he's causing LGBTQ folks, especially children, especially babies. Us on this call, except for Michael, we're grown. So there's a little bit of ways that we can move, right? But our babies, they need protection. So I want him to get uncomfortable about that. Then maybe we can have a real conversation about the uncomfortableness that he feels. Thank you so much, Brandon.
Thank you, Representative Raynor. We're grateful you can be here. And speaking of the real world impacts of these bills, I want to turn now to Brevard County School Board Member Jennifer Jenkins. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you for having me. I just want to take this opportunity to remind everyone that right now, while members of the legislature are gathering in a room with doors closed, surrounded by security far from their homes, they're deciding which political chess piece to move around. There's significant real world consequences from these actions. And so I just want to paint a picture. When our county released LGBTQ affirming guidelines, members of our local delegates spoke out against the true intent of them. And 2 hours before our school board meeting, protesters began gathering in front of the entrance of our school board. They were waving flags, holding offensive signs, yelling through megaphones, "You're going to hell." There were small children, maybe 5 to 8 years old, holding the same exact offensive signs, yelling through megaphones, things like, "Don't touch me, you pedophiles." LGBTQ supporters were there. They were gathered to the side of the entrance. They were standing quietly. They had affirming signs, advocating for themselves, for other students, their friends, and their family members. And I will never forget the faces of our students and their allies as I had greeted them outside. Their eyes were down. They were facing away from the protesters. They were on the verge of tears, and it was just an image of fear and disgrace and defeat. And as I stood there, an older gentleman approached those students and asked them, why they felt the need to do this to themselves. And as our students entered the building, an educational institution that constitutionally is bound to protect their rights, they had to press through a gauntlet flanked with anti-LGBTQ protesters who were taunting and chanting "shame on you" and yelling in children's faces and banging on locked doors when we reached capacity inside of our boardroom. Inside, we had grown adults frequently reassuring the students in the crowd that it wasn't them that they had a problem with, while actively attempting to hamper their individuality through public comments. Grown adults who believe these guidelines would tempt a straight boy to sexually assault a female student in a bathroom. Grown adults refusing to listen or be moved by the brave words and shared experiences of those students, those children that they came to speak out against. And a month later, this same community that's incited by fear-mongering and misinformation rhetoric of the members of the legislature gathered in front of my home in my small beach town. They held the same offensive signs. They shouted the same offensive chants at residents that were just passing by, all while claiming to defend their liberty while trampling on others. Our community decided not to match this hate. And over the next 2 days, we had a Chalk the Walk with Love campaign and brought people from all over the county to write affirming messages of support. And the most amazing part of that experience was meeting the families that were affected. I met families who were devastated that their community was angry for their children just existing. I met students who, during their school experience, explained how they faced bullying, harassment, felt shame, depression, thoughts of suicide. These are those real world impacts. And these are not chess pieces. There are children who are not old enough to vote about the decisions being made that will impact the rest of their lives. Are children who were brave enough to walk through a crowd of hate, share their most vulnerable experiences, and demand their right to live as they are. And I believe that as citizens of the state of Florida, we need to not only be brave enough to stand with our children and our students, but in front of them so that they never have to face the brunt of that political prejudice and hate ever again. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And now I want to turn to a dear friend of Equality Florida, longtime LGBTQ advocate and a licensed psychologist, Dr. Gary Howell.
Thank you for having me. Yes, I'm a clinical psychologist, and at this point I've worked with just shy of about 1,000 sexual and gender minority patients just in the Florida area alone, ranging from ages about 6 to 87, and that's just been since 2012. But I would like to speak to this refusal process because it is dangerous on a number of levels. Like, I echo some of what's already been said, but not only is it discriminatory, but it also opens the door for broader discrimination toward LGBT people and any intersecting identities that they hold, which just kind of compounds the situation. But what we've seen in other places, these kind of bills do lead to discrimination against sexual health, reproductive health, issues like substance abuse and sexually transmitted infections. So the denial of allowing that patient to enter the facility or refusing care is just another area of danger that comes with these kind of bills. We already know that sexual and gender minority patients face more healthcare disparities than most populations in this country, which means that some go without life-saving treatments already. And if we talk about transgender healthcare, that's even worse in terms of just being able to find a provider already who is affirming. So these kind of bills just stand to put more danger in the way of individuals seeking healthcare. And on top of that, some of the other movements that have been attempted in terms of targeting trans patients, for me, I see a lot of trans youth, and this would mean that I would be providing care to kids who need HRT or other services and often need me to sign a letter or see them for mental health purposes to allow them to move forward in the process. So not allowing qualified professionals to do their jobs is most certainly going to increase suicide attempts and completed suicides if we're not careful. We already know that this population is disproportionately affected by suicide, as was mentioned in the chat already. So we know that kids in this population in some areas of the country are 50% or higher of LGBT youth attempt suicide. So we already know that this is a high-risk population, and putting any other barriers in place only exacerbates those issues. And coming back to the school piece, where do most of our youth spend their time? At school. So sexual and gender minority youth, when they're at school, they already have a hard enough time trying to find supportive teachers and adults. And this is just going to make situations even worse. To wake up every day and worry if you're going to be bullied or invalidated leads to shame, lifelong shame for many of my patients. And this internalized process leads to internalized homophobia, internalized biphobia, internalized transphobia, which all are recipes for suicide. And as was mentioned, having one supportive adult, often parents, and this is in the CDC research for youth every year, leads to one of the most protective factors against suicide. Sometimes the only adult that a child has or an adolescent has is a teacher. So having a space where this is no longer acceptable also creates another issue for us, not only for the individuals in this process, but it is a healthcare issue in general. But I see this on a daily basis. I talk with kids and LGBT adults who've experienced these challenges throughout their lifetime, and suicide is a daily conversation in my practice. So I do urge folks to take a stand on this and try to keep fighting this issue.
Thank you so much, Dr. Howell. We're grateful to have you here. And finally, I want to turn, before we open it to some questions, I want to turn to another dear friend of ours at Equality Florida and a powerful young person, Michael.
Hi, my name is Michael. I am a genderqueer student in Central Florida. Personally, I've grown up in an affirming environment. I've been really lucky that my school, my teachers, my friends, they've all been really accepting. They've all used my pronouns. They've all made sure that they respect my boundaries when it comes to my identity. Overall, I've been really lucky in my environment. A big issue I have with this is that this bill these bills in general just turn me into the trans kid. The people passing these bills on paper, all they see the trans youth and LGBTQ youth in Florida in general, all they see us as are the trans kids, the gay kids, the not cisgender, not heterosexual kids. And if you sat down for 5 minutes, just 5 minutes, and actually got to know us, you know that that's not the only thing that there is to us. We are just like everyone else. You would know that I'm an actor, I love books, I take care of animals. You would know all of these other things separate from me being genderqueer. And there are other straight kids, cisgender kids who are like that as well. The only difference is that I don't identify with my body. That is the only difference. And like, it just doesn't really make sense, to be honest. Something that really upsets me about this is that they're talking about being trans and discovering these identities, they're treating it like it's a crime, which if this bill is passed, then it will be. And like, this isn't 1984 by George Orwell. Like, being trans is just normal. It's not normalized, but it is normal. And the only way that I discovered like this identity inside myself is because I had those conversations. I had those friends who educated me, and I did my research. And yeah, it's uncomfortable. But the thing is, when these adults who have not had my experience, who are not children, who are not transgender, who are not LGBTQ, when they're just telling us that we can't have these conversations because they're uncomfortable, think about our discomfort. We have to fear simple things, dressing rooms, restrooms. We need to fear shopping centers where when we look for clothes, it's man, woman. We have to deal with going outside and worrying, are we going to pass? Am I going to get dead named? Am I going to get misgendered? Like, compare that discomfort to what we already face. And then this bill just making it worse. Like, the discomfort is part of what we need to move forward. And if they're afraid of not having control over our identities and our lives, that's not our fault. Because we're just trying to grow up and know who we are. We're just trying to be kids.
Thank you so much. We're really proud of you and your courage, and grateful for you, and grateful for all of you for joining us today. I do want to take a moment to open it up to some questions. I know we have some members of the press who are on. If you have a question, you can use the raise hand function, or you can come off of mute. Just please introduce yourself for those who are watching at home. Just check in one more time if we have any questions from the press. If you have a question, you can come off of mute or use the raise hand function. Go ahead, Kirby.
Hi, thanks everybody for being here. My question for the lawmakers is, I understand that the bill that passed this morning that would, make it so the curriculum in K through 5 can, you can't mention sexuality issues, homosexual issues, stuff like that. What is the strategy to defeat that measure, given that it looks like it's being fast tracked? It's got 2 House committees instead of 3, and the legislature did take the turn last session to pass the athlete restricting transgender girls and women from playing scholastic sports. So basically, like, my question is, given that the LGBTQ issues took a step back during last year's session, what's the strategy for making sure that doesn't happen this time?
I can jump in real quick, Kirby. Thank you for the question. Listen, as far as the strategy goes, we just heard in the committee substantial concerns from, I think, at least 3 or 4 Republican members of the committee that need to be addressed, that speak to our concerns about the censorship of LGBTQ identities in schools, intentionally vague and subjective language that is included within the bill. But what we need is we need for those Republican lawmakers to follow up on those concerns with action. That's what we need. We need them to join us in our effort to stop this type of legislation from being able to be passed into law, because it will have a chilling effect on the type of support that LGBTQ youth are offered in our public schools, and it will have a chilling effect on inclusive policies that keep them healthy, prosperous, and safe. And I'll let Representative Raynor respond as well if she'd like.
Thanks, Rep. Smith and Kirby, for the question. I mean, I definitely agree with Rep. Smith. The folks that have concerns that, express their concerns today in committee, I'm challenging them to go beyond those just expressing concerns. I'm challenging them to vote down this bill. I'm challenging them to say, when they say that they are allies of the LGBTQ community, that they not only do that in word, but also in deed. I don't want to hear about your allyship. I don't want you to personally come up to me and tell me that you love me personally, but I have to do this. We don't have to do anything, because as the governor likes to say, we're in the free state of Florida. So you are free to do whatever you want to do. And if that means, if you want to really be an ally. I don't need your allyship to be performative. I need your allyship to be indeed. And I also, myself, Representative Smith and Senator Jones, we make up the mighty, the few, but the mighty LGBTQ caucus here in the state house, in the state Senate, in the legislature. So we are constantly thinking about ways that not only we can have conversations with individual lawmakers, but also moments like this, having folks come up to the Capitol, putting pressure, as I like to say, pressure bust pipes. So, it's going to take not only the pressure from inside of the chamber, but it's also going to take pressure from outside of the chamber as well, to try to put a stop to these harmful bills.
As a follow-up, I know that this bill is a major priority of the governor's. He's pushed for parents having more control over what their children are taught in schools. Would you be open to filing an amendment that strips the section about not teaching LGBTQ curriculum if the rest of the bill can, because it seems like from the perspective of someone that doesn't want this measure in the bill, it does seem to have some momentum given that it's wrapped up in this proposal that is supported by the governor and maybe other top Republicans. So would you be willing to see a version of the bill that doesn't have just the language that seems to strike at the core of the LGBTQ community?
Are just to clarify, Kirby, are you referencing the Stop Woke Act bill that the governor is openly supporting and pushing for? Or are you talking about the Don't Say Gay bill that I'm not aware whether or not the governor has mentioned or stated anything publicly about?
The latter, and I agree. I don't think he's mentioned anything publicly, but he has mentioned support for expansion of parental rights in schools, which I think the rest of the bill kind of falls along those lines.
Well, I'd say an amendment would be a start, but it does not address all of our concerns.
I agree with Rep Smith.
Oh, go ahead, Representative.
No, go ahead, Nadine. I was just saying, I agree with Rep Smith. I think that amendment would be the start, but I don't think that even with that amendment that I would feel comfortable supporting and voting upon this bill.
And I just want to add, we should be clear that this rhetoric doesn't match up to their actions. They're perfectly happy to interfere with a parent's right to seek medical attention for their child that is appropriate for them. There's no consistency here. In fact, you had the PTA as one of the loudest voices in the room calling out this bill for what it is. I'm a parent. This does not make my child safer in school. This is what I think what's important here is it's not actually being driven by a concern for parental involvement. This is about rhetoric that he wants to use to distinguish himself in the next presidential campaign. And so it's impossible to talk about a bill that is designed simply to stigmatize the existence of LGBTQ people as though there's a rational way for this to move forward. I mean, we support parental rights. We say it every time we're in front of these committees around these bills. What we don't support is stigmatizing LGBTQ people, speaking as though the existence of LGBTQ people is a dangerous topic that has to be regulated by the Florida legislature. This is surveillance state interference by government, despite all of the rhetoric about small government and conservatism. This is about the worst kind of intrusion. He's even talking about miking and putting cameras in the classroom so teachers can be monitored. This is all political theater, and it has a real human cost.
And Nadine, can I just say this? I think that you just made a point, and I don't want it to be glazed over. You made a point that you have a child, and you and your wife are concerned about what your child learns. And I feel like this rhetoric that the governor and his cronies are pushing, they not only does it devalue LGBTQ families, but it makes it seem that LGBTQ families don't care about what their kids are learning, don't care about what's happening in the school, don't care about any of those things. Guess what? They're parents. They love their kid, just like straight folks love their kids, right? Like, I don't think that there's any like difference. I don't think there's any level of love because you are LGBTQ or your child's LGBTQ. And so I think that once again, it's also that just like that divisiveness, that dividing to saying that us against them, that these bills are putting and really devaluing the humanness of LGBT people and families and children, because every family, or they should, they love their child just like anybody else loves their child. And that to me is also one of the most harmful parts of this bill, because it's literally creating a second class citizenship of LGBTQ families and people.
Thank you so much. I want to just quickly offer up space for any other press questions we have before we wrap things up. Go for it, Brooke.
Hey y'all, Brooke Badinger here with the South Florida Sun Sentinel. My question is about the some of the intentionally vague language in many of these bills. Seems like that could kind of be a way, to get around claims of like discriminating against like a particular marginalized group. Is there any, and I'm thinking back to last year's anti-trans athlete bill as well, how, transgender was never even mentioned in the bill, and it was kind of left intentionally, I guess vague is the term I would use. Is there any strategy to sort of get around that and call these bills out for, the people who they are targeting and would affect?
Brooke, I want to hop in, and I'll let obviously Rep Smith, I think he's back on. But one of the things that I have to give it to Rep Smith, it was my first year in the legislature, and he really kind of led the charge. When we file amendments, people are like, oh, you're filing amendments because you're going to vote in bill. No. We have these time restrictions, and we weren't able to really get into the meat and potatoes of the bill. So one of the things that Rep Smith led us in is filing amendments. And when we filed the amendments, we filed them in a way to call out the very thing that you're talking about, to name actually what these bills and this legislation is doing. The Republicans want to be coy and kind of like, oh, it's not really about that. No, let's call a thing a thing. Let's have the conversation out. And so I think that probably will be, once again, another one of our strategies. I don't know, but that's what we did last year to really identify the really harmful parts of these bills. And Rep Smith, I'll let you continue.
Thank you, Representative Raynor. Actually, I really appreciate this question, Brooke. I think it's important that we look at the language in front of us, particularly in the Don't Say Gay bill, because while some of the language is vague, our community, the LGBTQ community, is very clearly called out and articulated in the language. A school district may not encourage classroom discussion about sexual orientation or gender identity in primary grade levels. So as far as who we're talking about, which communities and which conversations are censored, the language to me is crystal clear. Don't be having conversations about gay and transgender folks, because yes, sexual orientation includes all sexual orientations. Gender identity includes all gender identities. But let's be clear, they're not trying to censor conversations about straight cisgender people. We weren't born yesterday. This is about making our community invisible and making conversations about our existence taboo, inappropriate, prohibited. Now, the parts of the bill that are vague intentionally are the parts around, well, who's the school district? It says the school district may not. Well, does that include the teacher? Does it include support staff? Is it paraprofessionals? Who's included in this language here? Well, if the teacher's going to read this, they might think that they're included. So they don't want to get in trouble. They don't want to have a conversation with any of their students because they think that someone is going to sue them if that conversation takes place. Those are the parts that are intentionally vague. But as far as who is being targeted, I think this language is crystal clear. Let's not kid ourselves that this is about censoring conversations about straight cisgender families.
Thank you. Thank you, Representative. Thanks for the question, Brooke. I want to be respectful of folks' time. I know our lawmakers have to jet off to committees and hearings. So thank you once again to everyone who was able to join. Thank you to our incredible advocates, to our elected officials, to our staff members, and to the members of the press. Not a bad first week as Equality Florida's new press secretary, I might add, and I'm grateful that you all went on that journey with me. If you have follow-up questions, I'm dropping my email in the chat right now. Happy to share any additional content with you that you need. But other than that, thank you so much for being here today. It was great to be with you.